My name is Avery Sloan. I'm 31 years old, and the night my father retired was the night he decided to erase me out loud in front of everyone who mattered to him. The room was full of applause when he said my brother's name, full of smiles when he listed everything my family had built, decades of work, millions of dollars, a future already spoken for. Then his voice changed. Just slightly. Enough to cut. He looked at me and said I deserved nothing, that I had never belonged, that my existence had been a mistake he regretted. People laughed, not nervously, not uncomfortably. They laughed like they'd been given permission to enjoy it. I stood there feeling something colder than humiliation, something final, like I was being buried while still breathing. I didn't know yet that as I turned to leave, a sealed envelope would be pressed into my hand. I didn't know who had written it, or how long the truth inside had been waiting. But that letter would decide whether I walked out invisible, or walked back in, holding everything they thought I could never touch. Before we go any further, if stories like this resonate with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who may need them most. And if you're watching from somewhere in the US or anywhere around the world, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there right now. I truly love reading them. Wherever you're watching from, I hope this story keeps you company tonight and reminds you that it's never too late for the truth to speak. The retirement celebration wasn't held at our house. My father chose a private event hall overlooking the harbor in Newport Beach, the kind of place designed to impress people who already believed they belonged at the top. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the water, reflecting rows of docked yachts like trophies. Everything about the room felt intentional. Controlled lighting, curated music, carefully spaced tables meant to guide movement and attention. It wasn't a family gathering. It was a presentation. My father, Douglas Sloan, stood at the center of it all, as if the space had been built around him. At 68, he still carried himself with rigid confidence, shoulders squared, voice sharp enough to command silence without asking for it. He loved moments like this. Moments where people watched, where his life could be summarized into applause and polite envy. The guests were mostly business associates, regional executives, local officials, people who had benefited from standing close to him over the years. They shook his hand with practiced admiration, thanked him for opportunities, laughed at stories they'd already heard more than once. Every compliment landed exactly where he wanted it to. I could see it in the way his mouth tightened just slightly each time someone praised his discipline, his toughness, his vision. I stayed near the back at first, close enough to be visible, but far enough to avoid conversation. That had always been my position in this family. Present but never centered. Known but rarely acknowledged. I watched servers glide between tables carrying champagne flutes, overheard fragments of conversations about market expansions and future partnerships, listened as people congratulated my brother even before anything had been officially announced. Connor moved through the room with ease. He always had. He wore a dark suit tailored to fit him perfectly. His posture relaxed, his smile effortless. People leaned toward him when he spoke. They laughed quickly at his comments, nodded as if everything he said carried weight. I recognized the pattern. I'd been watching it my entire life. From across the room, I caught my father studying Connor with open pride. It was a look I'd rarely received. When Douglas looked at my brother, his expression softened in a way that suggested continuity, legacy, certainty. When his eyes passed over me, they hardened again, as if I were an unresolved problem he'd grown tired of addressing. The walls were lined with framed photographs from earlier decades, my father standing beside shipping terminals, shaking hands with investors, cutting ribbons at newly acquired facilities. His history was everywhere, his version of it at least. There were no photos of quiet moments, no acknowledgments of the people who didn't fit neatly into the narrative he preferred to tell. I remember thinking how strange it was to feel like a guest in the story of my own family. I had known for weeks that this night was coming. I had prepared myself for what it would mean. Still standing there listening to the orchestra play softly beneath the hum of conversation, I felt something tighten in my chest. This wasn't just a retirement party. It was a ceremony of selection. And I already knew which role I'd been assigned. Connor had always known how to occupy a room without forcing it. Even as a child, he understood where to stand, when to speak, how long to hold someone's gaze. That night, it came naturally to him. He moved from group to group with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this future long before it arrived. People congratulated him quietly, prematurely, as if the outcome had already been decided. They spoke to him in lowered voices with knowing smiles. A man from one of our regional offices clapped him on the shoulder and told him the company was lucky to have young blood with real instincts. A woman I recognized from the board leaned in and asked how soon he planned to put his stamp on things. Connor smiled, nodded, deflected just enough to seem humble without giving anything away. I watched from my place near the edge of the room, noticing how no one asked where I fit into any of it. No one wondered aloud. It was as if the question had already been answered years ago. Growing up, Connor had been praised for his ambition, for his competitiveness, for his ability to win. My father admired those qualities openly. He encouraged them, rewarded them. When Connor pushed back, challenged authority, demanded more, my father called it leadership. When I hesitated, questioned, or chose a quieter path, my father called it weakness. I had learned early not to compare us out loud. It only ever made things worse. Connor caught my eye at one point and raised his glass in a mock salute, his smile sharp but controlled. It wasn't cruel. Not exactly. It was something colder than cruelty. It was certainty. He knew how this night would end, and he knew where that would leave me. I thought about how different our paths had been even under the same roof. Connor studied business and logistics, spent summers interning with my father's contacts, attended dinners where deals were discussed like family gossip. I went in another direction. I volunteered. I studied community development. I chose work that didn't impress my father because it didn't look like power. He told me once that I had no instinct for survival, that the world wasn't kind to people like me. Standing there watching Connor accept praise meant for a future already promised to him, I wondered if survival was the wrong word. Maybe what my father valued wasn't survival at all, but dominance, control, the ability to bend things in your favor and call it strength. Connor fit that vision perfectly. I did not. From the corner of the room I saw my father watching him again, his expression unmistakable. Pride, yes, but also relief. Connor was proof that his legacy would continue uninterrupted, that nothing about the empire he built would have to change. When my father's eyes slid toward me, the relief vanished. His gaze hardened just for a moment before he looked away. It was the same look he'd given me my entire life, whenever I reminded him simply by existing that not everything could be molded into his design. I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to become smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. I had spent years perfecting that instinct. But that night, something about the imbalance felt heavier, more deliberate. This wasn't just favoritism playing out in polite smiles and quiet praise. This was preparation. And I was already being written out of what came next. I didn't need the speeches to begin to know how this night would end. The pattern had been set long before the invitations were printed. As a child, I learned early what kind of daughter my father wanted. He wanted someone sharp-edged, someone who moved fast, spoke decisively, and never hesitated to take up space. Connor had been that child. Loud when it counted, competitive in ways that impressed adults, comfortable being watched. I was different, and my father noticed immediately. He told me once casually, as if it were an observation rather than a judgment, that I asked too many questions, that I lingered on details that didn't matter. that I cared too much about people who couldn't offer anything in return. I remember standing in the kitchen while he said it, my hands wrapped around a glass of water, nodding as if I understood. I didn't. Not really. I just knew the conversation wasn't meant to include my response. As I grew older, the gap between us widened. Connor's achievements were announced at the dinner table. His internships, his wins, his plans. Mine were acknowledged only when they couldn't be avoided, usually followed by a comment about practicality, about wasted potential, about how the world would eventually correct my idealism. My mother sat beside us through all of it, her presence quiet, her expressions carefully neutral. In private, she asked if I was okay. She told me she was proud. In public, she said nothing. I learned to separate those two versions of her. One that loved me and one that survived my father by staying silent. That silence shaped me more than I realized at the time. I stopped defending myself, stopped explaining my choices. I learned to make myself smaller, to step aside when conversations turned toward ambition and legacy. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't want what Connor wanted anyway, and that was true, mostly. What I wanted was never the company or the money. What I wanted was acknowledgement. Standing in that event hall surrounded by strangers who knew my father better than they knew me, I felt the weight of every unspoken comparison pressing down on my chest. The laughter, the easy assumptions, the certainty that Connor belonged here, and I did not. My father had already begun shaping the narrative, not just for the night but for years to come. He spoke about strength as if it were the only virtue worth honoring, about success as if it excused everything else. Compassion to him was a liability, hesitation a flaw. I realized then that this night wasn't about celebrating the end of his career. It was about solidifying his version of the story before he stepped away, choosing who would carry it forward and who would be erased from it. I stood near a table of desserts. I had no appetite for listening to the low hum of conversation, feeling like a ghost at my own family's milestone. The orchestra shifted into a slower piece. The lights dimmed slightly, subtle signals that the formal speeches were about to begin. My father straightened his jacket and moved toward the stage. I felt my pulse quicken, not with excitement but with a dull, familiar dread. I had told myself not to hope, not to expect anything from him. And yet, some small, stubborn part of me still waited for a different outcome. A word, a gesture, something to suggest I hadn't imagined all the years of distance. As my father reached for the microphone, I realized how dangerous that hope was. Because if he chose to take everything from me tonight, he would do it where no one could pretend it hadn't happened. The first sound that cut through the room was the sharp clink of my father's glass against the microphone. It was a small gesture, but it carried authority. Conversations faded mid-sentence. Servers slowed their steps. Even the orchestra softened into a low, unobtrusive hum. Douglas Sloan didn't ask for attention. He expected it. He stood beneath the warm wash of stage lights, his expression composed, almost serene. From where I sat, I could see the practiced ease in his posture, the way he squared his shoulders, the way his chin lifted just slightly as he surveyed the room. This was where he felt most alive, being watched, being listened to. Tonight he began, his voice steady and measured. We're not just marking the end of my career. We're celebrating what we've built together. A polite wave of applause followed. My father let it linger before continuing, savoring the moment. He spoke about the early years, about risks taken and sacrifices made, about how the company had grown from a small operation into a regional force worth tens of millions of dollars. Every sentence reinforced the same idea: strength had carried him here, control had kept him on top. As he talked, I watched the faces in the crowd. Heads nodded. Smiles appeared on cue. People leaned in, eager to be associated with his success even now. This was the version of him they knew, the visionary founder, the disciplined leader, the man who had bent an industry to his will. My father paused, letting the room settle. An empire, he said, is only as strong as the person who takes it forward. His gaze moved deliberately across the room, finally landing on Connor. The shift in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. Pride softened the sharp edges of his face. The corners of his mouth lifted just enough to suggest approval rather than command. "My son Connor," he said, his voice warming, "has spent his life preparing for this responsibility." Applause erupted louder this time. People turned toward Connor, some rising slightly from their chairs to see him better. Connor accepted it with practiced restraint, nodding, shaking hands, playing the role he'd been trained for. My father continued listing Connor's qualifications as if reading from a resume he'd helped write himself. Discipline, vision, leadership. The words landed easily, unchallenged. He spoke of the company's future as if it were already secured, already safe in Connor's hands. Then came the specifics. He announced the transfer of controlling assets, the properties, the majority stake, the operational authority that would place Connor at the center of everything my father had built. Each item was met with renewed applause, with murmurs of approval rippling through the crowd. I felt strangely detached as I listened. None of this surprised me. Still, hearing it spoken aloud, made official in front of witnesses, carried a different weight. It was one thing to know where you stood. It was another to watch the door close, in real time. My father extended his hand. Connor stepped forward, grasping it firmly. Cameras flashed. Smiles widened. The moment was captured from every angle, preserved for newsletters and social feeds and future introductions. Father and son stood side by side, framed as legacy and continuation. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, reminding myself to breathe. This was not my story. I had known that for a long time. And yet, as my father's hand finally dropped from Connor's shoulder, I felt something shift. A pause. A space where the speech should have ended. Instead, his eyes turned toward me. The warmth in his voice vanished. "And as for my daughter Avery?" The room leaned forward, sensing what was about to come. The silence stretched longer than it needed to. My father knew how to use it. He let it thicken, let the weight of anticipation settle over the room before continuing. When he spoke again, his tone was flat, precise, stripped of warmth. "And as for my daughter Avery," he said, pausing just long enough for every eye in the room to find me, "she will receive nothing." For a moment, the words didn't register. They hovered suspended, as if my mind needed time to decide whether they were real. Then the sound came back all at once. The sharp intake of breath from someone nearby, the scrape of a chair, shifting, the faint clink of glass against a table. My father didn't stop there. "She was never meant to be part of this legacy," he continued, his voice cutting cleanly through the hush. "Some people are born to carry weight. Others are simply mistakes." The word landed hard, not shouted, not dramatized. Delivered the way one might correct a record. I regret that she exists at all. The room broke. Laughter rippled outward, uneven at first, then louder, as if people were searching for cues, and finding them in my father's calm certainty. A few guests clapped, assuming this was some cruel joke. Others laughed because no one else seemed to object. Someone near the stage shook their head in amused disbelief. Connor laughed openly. His head tipped back, his shoulders shaking as though this were the best punchline of the night. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. The performance wasn't for my benefit. I felt heat flood my face. My ears rang. The room seemed to tilt just slightly, as if the ground beneath me had shifted. I searched for my mother without meaning to. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the stem of her wineglass, her fingers wrapped tightly around it. She didn't look up. I understood then that this wasn't just my father speaking. It was the family agreeing not to intervene. I wanted to say something. Anything. A denial. A protest. A reminder that I was standing there alive, breathing, but my throat locked. Years of swallowed words pressed against it, heavy and immovable. Silence had been my survival strategy for so long that it arrived automatically like muscle memory. I pushed my chair back. The sound of it scraping against the floor cut through the laughter, drawing more eyes to me. My legs felt unsteady as I stood, but I kept my head high. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cry. As I walked toward the exit, the laughter followed me, no longer confined to the stage. Someone muttered something about thin skin. Another voice joked that maybe I'd finally learned my place. Connor leaned toward a nearby table and said loudly enough for me to hear, "Guess the charity work didn't pay off." More laughter. Each step felt heavier than the last. I focused on the doorway ahead of me, on the idea of air of distance of leaving this room before the sound of it all could embed itself any deeper. I was almost there when I felt a hand brush against mine. Something was pressed into my palm. I stopped, startled, and looked down. A sealed envelope, thick paper, heavy. When I turned, my Uncle Henry stood beside me. His expression was calm, but his eyes held something urgent. "Don't walk away yet," he murmured, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "This was meant for you." Behind us, my father's voice rose again as he moved on as if nothing had happened. The party resumed. The laughter shifted back into celebration. But in my hand, the envelope felt impossibly heavy. For the first time that night, I didn't know what came next. I stood there longer than I should have, the envelope pressed flat against my palm, its edges sharp enough to anchor me in place. For a moment, I considered slipping it into my bag and leaving without looking back. That would have been easier, quieter, the kind of ending I'd practiced for most of my life. But Henry didn't move away. He stayed beside me, not blocking my path, not urging me forward, just present. It was a subtle kind of support, the kind that didn't demand anything, but also didn't disappear. "Who is it from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the stage where my father had already turned his attention back to Connor, basking in renewed applause. Only then did Henry look back at me. "Someone who didn't agree with what you just heard," he said. "Someone who planned for this." The words unsettled me. Planned for this. As if the humiliation I'd just endured hadn't been spontaneous but expected, accounted for. Behind us, the orchestra resumed its place in the background. Glasses clinked. Conversations picked up again, rearranging themselves as though I had never existed in the first place. It was astonishing how quickly a room could forget you. I looked down at the envelope again. There was no return address, no explanation. Just my name written carefully across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize at first glance. The letters were deliberate, familiar somehow. I felt a tightening in my chest. Not fear exactly. Something closer to reluctance. Opening it meant engaging, meant staying, meant allowing myself to take up space in a room that had just made it clear I wasn't welcome. "Do I have to open it now?" I asked. Henry met my gaze. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "But if you leave without reading it, you may never know why it exists." I closed my fingers around the envelope, feeling the thickness of the paper inside. There was more than one sheet. Maybe more than words. I thought about the years I'd spent stepping aside, about how often I'd chosen silence over conflict because it felt safer, about how easy it would be to walk out now and let this night settle into memory as just another confirmation of what I already knew. And then I thought about the way my father had spoken my name, not with anger but with certainty, as if erasing me were a simple correction. Something shifted. I turned back toward the room. A few heads turned as I retraced my steps. Some people watched with mild curiosity, others with open amusement. Connor noticed immediately. His smile curved slow and sharp. "Couldn't stay away," he said, just loud enough to carry. "Or did you forget something on the way out?" I didn't answer. I returned to my seat and placed the envelope on the table in front of me. The white surface made it impossible to ignore. My mother glanced at it briefly, then away again. My father noticed the movement and smirked from the stage. "What's that?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "A sympathy card." A few people chuckled. I didn't look up. I didn't respond. My attention was fixed on the envelope, on the way it seemed to wait. My hand steadied as I broke the seal. The sound of tearing paper felt louder than it should have, sharp against the low murmur of the room. I slid out the contents carefully. A letter written on thick stationery, and beneath it documents stamped with seals I didn't yet understand. I unfolded the letter slowly, my pulse thudding in my ears. The first line made my breath catch. It was addressed to me. Not as an afterthought. Not as a mistake. But as the person it had been waiting for. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I read the opening line again, just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. To my granddaughter, Avery Sloane. The noise of the room dulled around me as if someone had turned down the volume without warning. I could still see people talking, still hear the faint swell of music, but it all felt distant, unimportant. My grandfather's name was embossed at the top of the page, the ink pressed deep into the paper. George Sloane. A name my father rarely spoke anymore. My grandfather had died 5 years earlier. I remembered him as quiet, observant. He had never raised his voice, never dominated a room the way my father did. When he spoke, people leaned in, not because they were afraid to miss something, but because they wanted to understand. He'd asked me questions no one else bothered with. What I was reading. Why I cared about the work I did. What I hoped the world might look like if people were kinder to one another. I hadn't realized how much of that attention I'd carried with me until this moment. I kept reading. He wrote that if this letter was being opened now, it meant his wishes had been delayed. Possibly ignored. He acknowledged calmly and without bitterness that his son believed strength only came in one form. That power was something to be taken, defended, enforced. My grandfather disagreed. An empire can survive cruelty, he wrote, but it cannot be improved by it. My throat tightened. He explained that years earlier he had placed a portion of the company into a trust quietly, legally, and with intention. He had done it not because he doubted the company's success, but because he doubted the values guiding it. He wanted someone to lead who understood consequence, who recognized people as more than assets. I chose you, the letter continued. Not because you asked, but because you never did. I felt the weight of the words settle into my chest, heavy and grounding all at once. Beneath the letter were documents, official, stamped, signed. I didn't understand all of the language, but I understood enough. Control, authority, conditions already met. My father's voice cut through the haze. "What are you doing, Avery?" I looked up. For the first time that night, his expression wasn't composed. It was strained, uneasy. I stood slowly, the letter still open in my hand. Chairs shifted. Conversations fell silent in pockets around the room as people noticed the change. Connor scoffed, shaking his head. "She's making a scene?" he muttered. "This is embarrassing." I raised the letter slightly, my hand steadier than I expected. "I'm reading," I said. My voice carried farther than I thought it would. People nearby turned. The orchestra faltered, then stopped completely. The room stilled in a way it hadn't all evening. "I think everyone should hear this," I added, my heart pounding, my mind impossibly clear. My father took a step forward. "Sit down," he said sharply. I didn't. I looked back at the page and read the words aloud. Not for him. Not for Connor. For myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being spoken over. I was being addressed. And the truth, once given space, had a way of refusing to stay quiet. I read the letter slowly, letting each sentence land before moving to the next. My grandfather's words didn't accuse. They didn't rage. They simply existed, clear and deliberate, the way he had always been. He wrote about the early days of the company, about mistakes made in the pursuit of growth, about the moments when power had been used as a substitute for judgment. He acknowledged my father's discipline, his drive, his success. But he also named the cost of it. Fear can build structures, he wrote, but it cannot sustain people. A murmur spread through the room. Not laughter this time. Something quieter. Uneasy. I lifted my eyes briefly and saw faces turn toward me, faces that had laughed minutes earlier now drawn tight with curiosity. My father stood rigid near the podium. His jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the stand as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. I continued. My grandfather explained that the trust documents accompanying the letter transferred controlling authority upon my father's retirement. Not to Connor, not to the board, to me. He had anticipated resistance, anticipated disbelief. That was why everything had been finalized years ago, witness notarized, filed. Behind me, Henry stepped forward. "These documents are valid," he said calmly, his voice carrying authority without volume. "They've been in effect for years. Douglas, you know that." My father's face drained of color. Connor lunged to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Some outdated paperwork doesn't erase a lifetime of preparation. Everyone here knows who's been running this company in practice." I folded the letter carefully and held the documents higher, no longer shaking. "Preparation isn't the same as entitlement," I said. The words surprised me as they left my mouth. They weren't rehearsed. They weren't sharp. They were simply true. Connor stared at me, disbelief flashing across his face before anger took its place. "You don't even want this," he said. "You never did." "That doesn't make it yours," I replied. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the argument he'd relied on his entire life had finally failed him. Henry reached into his briefcase and produced another document, holding it up for the nearest tables to see. "This is the directive," he said. "The controlling interest transfers to Avery Sloan. Effective immediately." The sound that followed wasn't applause. It wasn't outrage. It was recognition. My father staggered back a step, his hand knocking against a glass. It tipped, shattered on the floor, champagne pooling across the marble. No one moved to help him. For the first time, the room wasn't responding to his presence. I looked at him then, not with triumph, not with anger, just clarity. The man who had spent decades defining worth through dominance now stood stripped of the only language he knew how to speak. Connor paced, muttering under his breath, his certainty unraveling with every step. My mother remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, tears slipping down her cheeks. When she finally looked up at me, there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not avoidance, recognition. I placed the documents back into the envelope and held it against my chest. I didn't feel victorious. I felt anchored. My grandfather hadn't given me this to punish anyone. He had given it to protect something. And for the first time that night, I understood that the power shifting in the room wasn't loud. It was final. No one spoke for several seconds after Henry finished. The silence wasn't heavy the way it had been earlier. It was hollow. As if the room had exhaled all at once and hadn't yet decided how to breathe again. My father lowered himself into a chair near the podium. Not with dignity, not with defiance. He sat as though his body had finally accepted something his mind had been refusing to name. His shoulders slumped forward, his hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles whitened. The man who had once controlled every conversation in the room now stared at the floor, unmoving. Connor broke the silence first. He laughed, short, sharp, and hollow. "This isn't over," he said, pacing a few steps before turning back toward me. "You can't just walk in here and take everything." I met his gaze steadily. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I was given responsibility. The words seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation would have. Around us, guests began to shift. Chairs scraped quietly against the floor. Conversations restarted in low, cautious tones. People who had cheered for Connor earlier now avoided his eyes. A few approached Henry murmuring questions. Others glanced at me with a mixture of curiosity and reassessment, as if trying to reconcile the version of me they'd dismissed with the one standing in front of them now. My mother stood slowly. For a moment, I thought she might go to my father. Instead, she came toward me. Her steps were careful, deliberate. She reached for my hand and held it between both of hers. "He always saw you," she said quietly. "Your grandfather." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't enough to rewrite the past. But it was the first time she'd said something that didn't ask me to make myself smaller. One by one, guests began to leave. The evening unraveled quickly after that. The lights seemed harsher. The music never resumed. What had been a celebration now felt like a room emptied of its purpose. Connor stormed out without another word, his anger loud even in retreat. My father remained seated, unmoving, his silence heavier than any outburst would have been. He didn't look at me again. I stood near the window for a moment, watching the harbor lights flicker against the dark water. The envelope rested in my hands, its weight familiar now. Inside, it wasn't just authority or ownership, it was recognition. Proof that someone had seen me clearly and trusted me with something that mattered. Henry joined me, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder. "There will be challenges," he said. "People will question this." "I know," I replied. And I did. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that leadership wouldn't feel natural at first, that I would be tested in ways I hadn't prepared for. But I also knew something else. I wouldn't lead the way my father had. As the room finally emptied, I took one last look back, not at the stage, not at the broken glass on the floor, but at the space itself. At the story my family had told for years now, irrevocably changed. I hadn't walked out invisible. I had stayed. And in doing so, I had stepped into a truth that had been waiting for me far longer than I realized. After that night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind kept returning to the same realization over and over again. For most of my life, I had believed that silence was safety, that endurance was dignity, that if I stayed quiet long enough, small enough, eventually the pain would pass. It didn't. What passed instead were years. Years of letting other people define my worth. Years of mistaking cruelty for authority and absence for truth. I had built my life around avoiding conflict, not realizing that avoidance was its own kind of surrender. My grandfather didn't give me power so I could win an argument or humiliate anyone in return. He gave me responsibility because he understood something my father never did, that strength doesn't come from domination. It comes from restraint, from choosing not to become what wounded you. That night didn't erase the damage. It didn't suddenly make my family whole. Some fractures don't heal. They simply become part of the landscape you learn to live with. But it gave me something I had never allowed myself before: permission. Permission to take up space. Permission to speak when it mattered. Permission to stop proving I deserved to exist. If there's one thing I carry forward from that moment, it's this: your worth is not negotiated in rooms where you are mocked for breathing. It doesn't require approval from people who benefit from your silence. And it doesn't disappear just because someone louder insists it should. Sometimes the truth waits quietly, patiently, until the moment you finally decide to stay. If this story resonated with you, I'd really love to hear from you. Share your thoughts or your own experiences in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. And if you feel comfortable, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It's a simple gesture, but it truly helps these stories reach others who may need them. Thank you for spending this time with me. Your presence here means more than you know.